Well, good evening. As we come back again for our continued look at where did Jesus go today, we get to Thursday. We getting closer to the crucifixion. That will be tomorrow. But as we think about Thursday and what events did Jesus do on Thursday, and we've been through 3 days already. Actually 4 if you count Sunday as Jesus' triumphal entry, all the way down to today. As we remember what he done Thursday, and if you think about Thursday and what he done, you'll see that he was making preparation for the sacrifice. Now, obviously Thursday was the day that we'll read about in just a minute, to where they started commemorating the Passover. And if you remember, the Passover ultimately goes all the way back to Egypt when God killed all the Egyptian firstborn babies. And so as he done that, the Hebrew children would put blood over their doors, and as they would do that, the Passover, they would pass over them and not kill their firstborn. And so it's a commemoration of that. The Jewish custom was to keep that and always remember that, and they still do. And so they are preparing for the Passover feast, and that's what they're doing on Thursday. And so you'll see that, and I want to look at a few things particular that went on Thursday. And so the first one is the table is set. Now, Jesus asked Peter and John if they would to go make ready this the feast that they were about to have, and we see that in Luke chapter 22. You can read about it in all 4 Gospels, but we're going to go to Luke tonight. And so Luke chapter 22 verse 7, it says, "Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare us the Passover, that we may eat." And so Jesus sends them out, and they go on into town. And obviously, if you remember the story, you remember they went to a house and asked a guy, the master needs a room, and so anyway they get a room, and they're able to have the Passover there in that house. And so we see where the table is beginning to be set. Jesus asked them to go make preparations. And then in verse 14 through 20 it says, "And when the hour was come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him. And he said unto them, With desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say unto you, I will not any more eat thereof until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And he took the cup and gave thanks and said, Take this and divide it among yourselves. For I say unto you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God shall come. And he took the bread and gave thanks and brake it and gave unto them, saying, This is my body, which is given for you. This do in remembrance of me. Likewise also the cup after the supper, saying, This is the cup of my New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you." And obviously this is where we get the Lord's Supper from. This is the first place it occurred at, is Jesus sat down, as it says there in verse 14. He sat with the 12 disciples, and they sat there and they had the Passover meal. Now this is later in the day because, as we'll see, most of the events of that day unfold after this. And so they have this Passover meal. They've used most part of the day to get the place set up and the place ready to have it. Now they've had the meal, and Jesus goes through the process of having the Lord's Supper here with them, talking about the broken body and the shed blood. And we still commemorate that now, even with our own churches, and we'll do that this Sunday morning. Although it'll be over internet and using Facebook like we are, we'll be doing it that way. But we always commemorate it using the Lord's Supper to remember the broken body of Jesus and the blood that was shed. So you see the table is set. Now, the second thing you see is strength is sought. And as we move on in Luke chapter 22, in verse 39, you see Jesus goes to the garden, and he goes there to pray. We see Jesus do that often. He does that several times. And look in verse 39 through 45, it says, "And he came out and went as he went to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples also followed him. And when he was at the place, he said unto them, Pray that you enter not into temptation. And he was withdrawn from them about a stone's cast, and kneeled down and prayed, saying, Father, if thou be willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. And there appeared an angel unto him from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was as if it were great drops of blood falling down to the ground." And this is the story that we read about and we think about when Jesus is in the garden praying. And he always, we say that prayer, if there be any other way, God, God, I'm willing to do this. I'm willing to do this. If there's any other way, we'll do that. But if not, God, this is the way that it needs to be, then I'm willing to do it. And Jesus done that because he loves us so much that he's willing to go to the cross for each one of us. And we see that there in verse 42. And then 43, an angel appears. An angel appears to Jesus to strengthen him, to encourage him, to be with him. I don't know what all was going on there. I don't really know what Jesus' complete thoughts were. We talked about that some yesterday. Jesus was as much human as we are, but yet he was still God. And so he had some of the same thoughts that we have and the same struggles that we have. And he needed to overcome those. And so the angel comes to strengthen him. And then verse 44, we've all heard of Jesus praying, and the sweat that comes off of him looks like blood. I couldn't imagine how hard he was praying, how sincerely he was praying. And perhaps as he was praying for each one of us, because he knew why he was going to the cross. It wasn't for himself. It done him no good. It was only for us. And as he sat there and prayed in the garden that night, I wondered just what was going through his mind. As maybe my name was on his mind, and maybe your name was on his mind. And as he thought about us and he thought about our eternal state, that drew blood from him. And it just, he began to sweat there and thinking about those things and the things he must endure. And it says there in verse 42, his sweat was it were great drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, obviously, that's also the same story where the disciples are there and he finds them asleep. And he tells them basically to sleep on, that the time's coming and the time is now. And so then you see the third thing that happens. Now, remember, as we're talking about this, and I'm doing all this on Thursday, is Thursday, but this is actually late into the night, Thursday night. You may even say it's early Friday morning. So we're going to put this on Thursday. On Friday, we'll deal with the events that happened during the daytime on Friday, but we're going to combine Thursday night all into Thursday. And so as we talk about that today, I want to kind of give you a little bit of what's going on that night, because this is when the betrayal takes place. And the third thing we see, a kiss was given. And in Luke chapter 22, verse 47, it says, and while he yet spake, behold, a multitude, and he that was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them and drew near unto Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said unto him, Judas, betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss? When they which were about him saw that would follow, they said unto him, Lord, shall we smite with a sword? And one of them smote the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. And Jesus answered and said, Suffer ye thus far. And he touched his ear and healed him. Now this is obviously the time when Judas comes up to Jesus and betrays him with a kiss. I couldn't imagine doing that. We think about Judas and we think about his intentions and how he was and how he betrayed Jesus. And Jesus is standing there and Judas walks up to him and gives him a kiss, knowing that was the final point of the betrayal. And then they're there to arrest Jesus and take him in. And one of the disciples pulls a sword out and cuts off the ear of one of the soldiers. And Jesus, even though he's being arrested and even though he's got all these things ahead of him, he's still concerned about this soldier. He's still, he's still God. He's still Jesus. He still loves this soldier, even to the point that the soldier is fixing to carry him off to a cross. Jesus picks his ear up off the ground and he puts it back on his head and it's healed. That's the difference in Jesus. That's who it is that we call Jesus. Jesus does that in the midst of all that was going on, in the midst of all that soldier was about to do to him. Jesus heals him and puts his ear back onto his head. I couldn't imagine how that was, and maybe I'd like to know the thoughts of that soldier. It's not recorded what that soldier said or done, and perhaps one day we'll get to talk to that soldier. I don't know if he's in heaven or not. I don't know what his eternal state was, but I can't help but believe maybe that soldier said, man, what kind of guy, when I'm here to arrest him, is more worried about me than himself? And so we see that the betrayal is there. And Jesus is betrayed, and he's arrested. And the fourth and last thing that we see happening Thursday night is the weeping begins. And you say, well, who's crying? And I'm going to say it's the disciples. The disciples are crying that night. And even though we're talking about Jesus and what did he do, I want to look just a little bit at the disciples. In Luke chapter 22, verse 54, It says, then they took him and led him and brought him to the high priest's house, and Peter followed afar off. Now here's Peter, the one that just said that he would not betray him, and that was all happening while they were having the Passover meal. Peter is found here following far off. Sometimes we do that. Sometimes as things get hot and things get tense, we kind of back up and we say, well, we don't want to get too close to that. We might be involved in it. And Peter began to do that. He began to back off. And it says in verse 55, and when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the hall and were set down together, Peter sat down among them. But a certain maid beheld him as he sat by the fire, and earnestly looked upon him, and said, this man was also with him. And he denied him, saying, woman, I know him not. And after a little while another one saw him, and said, thou art also them. And Peter said, ma'am, I am not. And about the space of an hour another confidently affirmed, saying, of a truth this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean. And Peter said, man, I know not what thou sayest. And immediately while he yet spake, the cock crew. And the Lord turned and looked upon Peter. And Peter remembered the words of the Lord. He had said unto him, before the cock crow thou shalt deny me thrice. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. And I don't know where exactly all the other disciples are at this time. It's not really recorded. But we see Peter, he's still in the sight of Jesus. He's not gotten so far away that Jesus can't see him. Because here we see where he's denying Jesus. And Jesus, one last time, turns and looks over his shoulder straight at him, convicting Peter of the sin he's just committed of denying him. And there we see Peter went out and wept bitterly as he hears the chickens. You know, sometimes it doesn't take a lot for us to realize we've done wrong. When Peter realized he done wrong, it was the crow of a chicken. You know, I talked about that one time in a sermon. You know, just the noise of that chicken. We've got some chickens here at home, and sometimes they can get loud. But just as you hear that chicken crow, it reminded Peter, you know what? I failed. I failed at a point of temptation. I failed at what I was trying to do. I was trying to do right. And Peter realizes right there that he's not very strong. But Jesus has forgiveness. And I think Jesus looked at him. And I don't think Jesus looked at him as a judgmental thing. I think Jesus looked at him and said, forgiveness is still here, Peter. Forgiveness is still here, because we read about later on how Peter came back, and Peter was one of the greatest disciples that ever was. So as you think about what did Jesus do today, talking about Thursday, he began to prepare for the sacrifice, knowing that he was the sacrifice that was about to be used. Thank you for listening today, and we'll be back tomorrow with Friday and the events of that.